every effort that we can to produce a documentary that could be contributing to the oral history of the revolution.
So, about 8 months ago, Marwan, who's an incredible human rights activist, said he wanted to get news out of Syria. As you know, it's very difficult now to see any, I'll let you talk, see any form of news in an original context from sort of Syria. So he invited me and Firas, a Lebanese director, to meet 15 extraordinary Syrian young journalists who came over to the border. We were in Adana to spend a week with them. And what he was going to do, after he finished, he was going to spend about 8 months trying to get them to make a film. But the point was that it wasn't supposed to be a documentary. It was supposed to be something that had cinema quality to it, because the whole point about cine texture is it's emotive, or it's what we call decorative. And when I say decorative, that's when you use style for style's sake. Cinema draws you in. Sometimes there may be no music, it might be the gaze, it might be someone looking at the camera, but it uses very strong devices. So on that basis then, I've made this, I'll show you this. I'm just going to show you the beginning of what I've done, and then I'm going to hand it to Marwan. Where's he gone? And then, as we draw, what time is it? 3:30, correct. As we're getting towards the end, I'm going to perhaps give another trend analysis, what I believe cinema journalism is going to be hugely, hugely popular. And it has to do with the fact that there are very similar analogies between art, the movement of art, and the movement of video. But I'm just going to show you this first. I haven't translated it, but I'm just going to show you it so you might be able to translate it as it's going along. Only about 2 minutes.
بعد ما نزلت القذيفة بشكل مباشر، الشيء اللي ردة الفعل تبعيتي كانت الوحيدة إني أنا جريت نسمة من المكان اللي كانت واقفة فيه وضميتها وصارت تحتي. أنا عملت مثل شكل مظلة. بتذكر بس والحالة يعني إنه كان في شيء عم بضرب فيني.
So he's talking about the moment he took that
مثل رصاص أنا هيك حسيته.
one of the journalists
بالإضافة لحجر عم بتسقط فوقي.
He was saying that the first thing he wanted to know if the girl was safe. So
والكاميرا شغالة وانتقلت فيها
she was safe.
لمدخل بناية لأن كان ممكن إنه تنزل قذيفة تانية.
And then we run to the
الشيء اللي بتذكره بس لحد اليوم هو صوت نسمة بس، لأني كان بيهمني إنه نسمة تكون بخير. هذا اللي صار بهديك اللحظة. فقط هي الذاكرة الوحيدة اللي بتذكرها. الذاكرة الثانية كانت هي موجودة بالكاميرا فقط. طالعين
والله هلا في قناص.
وين نروح هلا؟
بدنا نقعد على الطرف الثاني.
هلا احنا بسيف الدولة. رايح وقف على اطلال بيتي. هي سيف الدولة. اخو الاحمى معه بخير يروح على البيت. هلا رايح اشوف.
You wanna cross? He's afraid from the sniper. You wanna go to the other side to see his mom.
بشكل فعلي
تلاقي واقف على البلكون ورايح وراجع حاطط
أثناء
جوازات
الاعتقال أنا تعلقت لمدة طويلة مع
And what he says here is quite extraordinary. If you're a Syrian journalist,
بعدين فك لي إيد واحدة بقيت معلق على هاي الإيد هون حاليا في خلع عندي بالمفاصل كتفي مخلوع.
He's talking
وأنا
about
معلق
one
طبعا ما
moment where he was
يلبس شيء
arrested by the regime and he was
شو اسمه حط
like they hanged him.
وصار عندي تشوه. نسيت في هذا الموضوع تشوه. فالكهرباء كانت دائما مزروعة بجسمي بشكل دائم. أنا هون فعلا حسيت بالموت. لأن كنت مطعون 4 طعنات بظهري وفي جرح براسي معلق أنا وأنا معلق بالهواء أي دائما كهرباء مع الحديد والقصاص هي وحتى كان في علامات أنا هون خلال هي الفترة الاعتقال الثاني أنا كنت متوقع إنه ما أطلع.
It was his second time he was arrested, and that time he thought he's never going to be out.
so I'm still going to have to finish that. But what we were trying to do with that is to make it more cinema-driven. So there's lots of cinema ideas of intertitles, which are you might see at the beginning of films, so that we can actually take the reporter out of it. I want to bring in Marwan now, because the reason also Marwan and I are doing this is because Marwan's background as both an activist and working in Syria, and the work that he does is huge, but also the legacy of what we were doing was that when we got together for the 1 week to train the Syrian journalists, we had a war room where they would discuss their stories and we would try and get their stories together. I had to go back to the UK, but Marwan stayed with the group, got video back from them. And at this stage, I want him to talk about, because you have a trailer, yeah, and he also has launched the website with it. And I think it's important, his director who put it together is also someone who comes from a film background, so he treats video in a fundamentally different way. And then after that, to sort of wrap it up with some Q&As, but as I said, just to talk to you about why, given the evidence I've got from this long study, I feel you're going to be seeing a lot more cinema journalism, and the fact that it begs an interesting question for me. If the audience is saying to us that actually they like films and they can tell the difference between cinema fact and cinema fiction, and if the audience are saying to us that actually they want to make their films in a cinema way, how does that influence the way we teach TV journalism or journalism, video journalism? It's also very dangerous because in the hands of one person, you can get propaganda. How do you stop that? So there are huge questions you need to resolve. But the point I'm making is, I'm not making this up. It's the evidence that I've seen that is saying this. So it's going to happen. It's not me saying it's that, it's the evidence. So it's in our face. How do you begin to look at it in such a way as to either make sure it works in the way that as journalism is fact, it can still be factual? Do you want to show your thing here?
Sure.
Can talk about it.
So, yeah, as David mentioned, I'm not a journalist. I'm a human rights lawyer, so I come from a different background. But we have been working a lot with video journalists or like normal citizens who are trying to cover news in Tunisia, Syria, and other countries in the Arab world after the uprisings. The idea of that project came when most of the video journalists inside of Syria were frustrated with how news is being covered. Like first frustrated with international media, how they are like the coverage they were doing on the conflict, and also frustrated because most of the time they could not really cover where they would like to cover, because most of the time big news channel would like to see only the Islamists or the big bearded guys or only the armed conflict. So the idea came to produce short features that could really tell human stories behind the conflict. That's why we invited David over to Turkey, and we brought 15 video journalists, like citizens from Syria. I don't know what to call them. You know, you have someone who's the guy you saw with long hair. He's an actor. He does theater, and he became now a video journalist. And the idea was to collect as many stories we can in order to produce attractive stories that could tell the Syrian conflict in a different way. We end up by doing a documentary about 3 major stories we collected. It's a 57-minute documentary. It's called False Alarm. In Arabic, it's Talaq Kazzab. So we don't have internet here. So if you can type false alarm movie.com, you can see the website of the movie.
Okay, it's here somewhere. Here it is.
Wait 1 second. Yeah. You need to. Yeah. This one, and then trailer. Maybe you can do open with. Because this is .move. It might be a problem with your.
Ooh.
All right. This is the movie.
All right, well, you have to show them the movie there, a bit of the movie then.
Can't you do the other one? Can't you do open with like another
Okay.
webs, another?
Open file.
Here, can't you double? Nothing.
No, if I double click it, won't it just didn't
Oh,
open there? So
alright,
just
it's
try
fine.
this. We go back to Shiva. False alarm. Trailer. Open, damn it.
Anyway.
No.
Alright, it's fine.
You. Does it play on yours?
حاولنا لي أكثر من حاولت يعني
Yes,
أكثر
so,
من
but the
مرة
problem I cannot link it to the
إني
because it doesn't have a. So basically the.
كاميرا محمد نور بس للأسف ما
Where's the bit where they're on the
This one. Yeah, before.
جثة واحدة هناك، شهادة عن أثر السيارة.
بين الميت.
هذا هو العرض.
قالت مصادر لأخبار الآن أن عناصرا من ما يعرف بالدولة الإسلامية في الشام والعراق التابعة للقاعدة سيطروا على مراكز للواء أحفاد الرسول التابع للجيش الحر، وذلك في مدينة الرقة في شمال سوريا. وأفاد المرصد السوري لحقوق الإنسان أن الهجوم بدأ بتفجير سيارة مفخخة بمقر أحفاد الرسول في حي محطة القطار في شرق المدينة.
طلعوا الشباب سيارة الإسعاف ليجيبوا بعض الجرحى.
Or just before, I think just before this. Yeah.
Okay, yes. Nice shot here. I like this.
Before that, but started on that. So basically the movie tries to talks about human stories, and basically most of the character of the movie are the video journalists themselves. So they shot the movie. So it talks about their lives, the way they are working inside of Syria, and they tell also the stories of where we are now from the whole conflict. So through their stories, through the way they are covering the news, they are telling also the story of the conflict. From a revolution to a civil conflict to a civil war to whatever you want to call it now.
And what's the name of the website called?
The website is falsealarm-movie.com. Were you able to open it? Were you able to open it? You haven't?
Yeah,
okay.
So false alarm.
Yeah.
.com?
movie.com. And the trailer is on the website, so you can see it.
Okay. But I mean, we can do a very quick Q&A. This is who we are. a sort of reality. This is who we are in terms of Twitter. So please engage with Marwan. He's an incredible fella.
I didn't talk too much because I'm talking tomorrow, so that's why.
Yeah, so we're going to go and see him in Syria, but I hope this will lead to other bits. Please, if you have any questions, because I'm going to wind down now, but I suppose the point I've been trying to make all along is this is the name of a book called Reality is Broken, and that's very much how I feel we are at the moment in terms of what the professionals and the amateurs and the video journalists, there is no such thing as the news as it used to be in the 1960s, or even then. In the 1900s, any art historians here? Any art historians? Okay. In the early 1900s, the classical form of art was dominant in the world. The way you got your news was through paintings. If somebody rich was getting married, they did a painting. About the turn of the century, something strange happened. A couple of key figures, Monet, Manet, Cézanne, formed the Impressionist movement. You're nodding. You know this. Yes? Help me out if you feel. Please, talk. Something incredible about the Impressionists is this. Firstly, they said, we're not going to show painting, classical, like it is. We have an impression of what we think the mood is, and that's what we will try and convey. Something called the Académie des Beaux in Paris. These are men who controlled the art movement, got very angry with the Impressionists, and they ostracized them. They actually said, you will never, ever show your works in Paris again. So the likes of Monet, Manet, Cézanne had to show them on the streets. And this is significant because what happened, what made painting as it is, was it became very, very popular. It used to be controlled around 1830, 1840 by a very strong set of people. By the time it got to about 1900, everyone could buy paintbrushes. You could buy paintbrushes, you could buy paint. Everyone was painting. The Impressionists came along and interpreted life their way. Today, one of the most expensive paintings is made by an Impressionist. The Impressionist movement came up with Cubism, the Spanish Picasso, a whole range of them. There are very strong similarities with video. We now know, or all of us here know how to do video. At some stage, the audience starts to pick out, I cannot watch 40 million videos on YouTube anymore, but actually I'm interested in your impression on Syria. And then all of a sudden, your impression, professional impression, because you have that experience, matters. And that's what I feel when you look at the similarities between the two. Remember, it's only 2005 that we've learned this huge new language of video. Before that, the people who used to do it were the professionals, the Académie des Beaux. Now, since 2005, YouTube, the Impressionists have come along, and they've started to make their videos. And what you'll see is very gradually a movement towards those kind of news items. Not because they are better than TV news. That's not my point. Because they offer an alternative, a way in, an authored way in, a video essay, a kind of Bresson or Godard way into a story that is rich and new. Hakewati, who you showed briefly, used to be a theatre director before he picked up a camera because of the war. So he brings a particular perspective to what he does. And the more that this language, if people pick it up and they're prepared to push it forward, I think you'll find some very interesting collisions now between video, video essay, video style cinema, and traditional, because the audience is going in a certain way. I'm not saying it will happen tomorrow. I'm not saying it's going to happen because that wasn't my research. All my research tried to do was say, what is this new style? What is it called? And all of them, when you ask them, say, I'm doing cinema. When you interview them, they say, well, this film influenced me. They don't say this news piece influenced me. They say this cinema piece influenced me. So I hope I haven't bored the pants of you too much. What I've said, I hope, hasn't been too controversial either. But what I hope I have said is that in some way, the way we look at making films, whether it's news, the texture that seems to draw the audience in has a cinema ideology behind it. However, it is dangerous because there are things we haven't spoken about here. If you're not used to it, if you can't see patterns, what then? How do you teach it? When I teach my students TV news, do I teach them cinema as well? What is cinema? There's no one definition. It's impossible to find a definition of cinema. All we do know is that when you see cinema, you know it's cinema. And the audience can tell the difference between cinema fact and cinema fiction. Okay, so I'm going to thank you for your time, but if you have any questions, please, this is the bit that I go into my lecture mode, so please ask lots of questions before we round up. Please, yeah.
Yes, you mentioned propaganda, David, and Marwan mentioned the fact that some journalists maybe in Syria aren't quite so happy the way that some things in the country are reported. Now, I work for the BBC, and we do think of ourselves as being very objective and unbiased, but I've got a very good friend of mine who comes from the Muslim world, and when I told him I worked for the BBC, he said, "Oh, that propaganda station." So being not biased is obviously very subjective, isn't it? My question is, well, to the two of you actually, how do people in Syria view the way that the conflict is reported in the Western world? Are we biased?
Okay, I'm going to let you answer that. I've got an answer.
Then my answer?
You're going to do the Syria one, because you do the Syria. A very clever academic in the US said that journalism is a social construct informed by societal and literary changes.
Who said so?
Michael Schudson, Schudson. Journalism is a social construct. What that means is, and it's formed by cultural changes and literary backgrounds. What that means is, a journalism practice in the UK, as much objective as that nation or nationality may feel, is very different from a culture elsewhere. So you can't win this one, you will never win, because journalism itself is a social construct. The BBC decided what would be journalism, whether it was impartial, objective or not. The Chinese decide on their version of journalism. North Koreans, they can still call it journalism. We can't, you might think it's bad journalism, but that's their ideology for that cultural belief. And it's an important one, because when I go and do things in Tunisia, I don't for one moment try and say, I might talk about ethics from the Western, one of the things I showed you is from an academic from Ireland who talks about the Western hegemony of news. It became universal, and it's true. Everyone bought into ideology. The internet starts to show up these little schisms, even with the US. So for instance, we believe that impartiality, Fox TV does a different type of news. Is that not news? It is to them. So Lyotard's famous 1988 essay about the end of grand narrative tells us that this is a fight you can't win. Whatever you do, you can only believe culturally in what you do. And hopefully people will buy into that. Yeah?
I would start by saying there's a difference between being subjective and propaganda. There's a big, huge difference. Yes, sometimes video journalists tend to be subjective, and that's a big challenge that citizen journalists and video journalists are facing inside of Syria, because they consider themselves part of the revolution. So of course, they are not being objective to the 100%. They would say martyr, not killed. Like small examples of but also there's a whole category of propaganda. When Al Jazeera sent a request for a video journalist to do a piece, they asked them, we want a rebel from the FSA in the piece, although they are talking about the hospital that have nothing to do with FSA. fighters. So this is propaganda. You know, they are doing a propaganda for a certain.
Can you put this up?
For a certain category. The same thing with foreign coverage of the conflict. A lot of Syrians consider that foreign journalists are not being able to get into the country. Then they are basically reporting from the borders and calling some people, telling them, I would like to have one Shiite, give me 2 interviews from 2 Alawite, 1 Nusra, and I will write up my article. And this is pissing off a lot of people. You know, like a lot of people inside of the country are pissed when all the journalists, when came in, they were really attracted by Jabhat al-Nusra and the ISI only by them, only by the Islamists, and covering how the revolution is becoming Islamist. So they were really teared by this idea, although they could have covered and provided a platform for non-violent people. Again, this is like very challenging. I'm just portraying what they say. I have a different view on that regard.
Moving on very quickly, 2 more questions because we have to go in 9 minutes. I want to pose the last statement. The last statement I want to end with before I give the camera this to you is, the point I'm making is the conditions that existed in 1948 for how we would make news, do those conditions still exist today?
Where do you see what Vice and Vice News is doing, how to fit into all of this?
It's their version of taking news which has a cinematicness to it, yes. Vice reminds me of Reportage, BBC Reportage, Network 7. The question is whether the classical audience buys into it to give it that kind of catalyst. But Vice is trying to look at news from a perspective of young people who particularly are drawn to cinema. Any more? We've got about four more minutes. Okay, I think that's a question of ethics, though, isn't it? I mean, ethics, whether you're doing cinema journalism or not, ethics still stands. So I think...
Clearly it was an ad.
Sorry?
Clearly it was an ad.
Yeah.
You know, it was an advocacy, fundraising.
So it's fine, but is it the question when I no longer agree with it, becomes problematic?
All right, 2 more questions very quickly and we go. Just by the way, Coney 2012 was a very clever piece of cinema. It was about Coney, but how it starts has all the trappings of cinema. Very clever. 40 million views. If you want 40 million views, do cinema. Who's next? When you say people, the audience? No, I think the audience understands cinema. You're going into, if you go too far, you're going into something called docudrama. Okay, so... No, I can't say that. All I've seen is particular people use styles and techniques and narrative. Very importantly, for instance, if you're... last one. If you're reporting, a reporter's voice is third party. So today, you join us, it's projected. A cinema voice is different. If you listen to trailers, like now Travis Fox, it's downplayed. It has a different tone. And that gives the impression of someone different from a reporter telling you. So those things inform the whole piece. But your story, I know what you're saying. There is a version like docudrama where it goes too far. But the audience still is clever to say, I don't believe in that. Is that it then? Are we finished? He's Mr. Is that it then? Yeah, are we done? Okay. You say, if you don't have any more questions, Marwan and I thank you very much for your time. You've been a brilliant host. Thank you very much indeed. I hope there was something in there for you. Thank you. Thank you again. Cheers.